London's sky was grey that June morning, but inside the Royal Global Convention Hall, it was electric. The 2025 Global Voices Forum had pulled in names from every corner of the planet: activists, presidents, royals, and reporters. What no one saw coming, not even the press, was the arrival of Meghan Markle, unannounced, in a soft beige suit with no security entourage. The cameras lost their minds. She was introduced simply as a surprise guest moderator. The room roared in approval. Meghan smiled, nodded, and walked slowly to the table, already holding President Ibrahim Traoré, the fiery 36-year-old revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. Meghan glanced at him, then at the crowd. The applause faded. Traoré sat upright, expression unreadable. He had come alone, without an entourage. Just him and a folder under his arm titled, "Truth is Not War." As the panel began, they spoke on justice, race, and power. The tension rose like steam. Some praised Traoré's bold reforms. Others whispered he was too blunt for diplomacy. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened when Meghan turned to him after a long silence and asked a question no one expected. The room held its breath. Meghan cleared her throat, her voice smooth and polished for the microphone. "President Traoré," she began, glancing at her notes, "you speak often about colonization, foreign interference, and African pride." A few nods from the crowd. "But do you truly believe your rhetoric is helping African progress, or just making headlines?" The silence was a vacuum. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some gasped. A few looked visibly uncomfortable. Cameras zoomed in. Meghan maintained her calm, but her tone, a delicate mix of curiosity and challenge, didn't go unnoticed. Social media would later call it passive-aggressive with a royal glaze. Traoré didn't blink. He didn't smile. He leaned forward slowly, placing both hands gently on the microphone. Then he said, in a voice that was soft but unshakably firm, "Progress doesn't come from headlines. It comes when truth makes people uncomfortable." The words landed like thunder, muffled in velvet. The room froze. Not even the click of a camera. Meghan looked stunned, just for a second. Somewhere in the back, a woman in a wheelchair clapped. Then others. Then more. Within 15 minutes, the moment was everywhere online. Traoré unshaken and Meghan question exploded. TikTok, X, YouTube Shorts. But the cameras didn't catch what was happening inside Traoré. He was remembering something he had never spoken about publicly, something that still haunted him. In that perfectly lit London hall, President Traoré looked composed, but behind his eyes, flames danced. He wasn't thinking about Meghan. He was remembering Compiègne, the village where his aunt had died, burned alive by militia backed by a mining company years ago. He was 14. The soldiers had said they were protecting assets. But Traoré remembered the way his aunt screamed when they locked the door of her hut. He remembered the silence of the world, the headlines that never came. That day, no one cared about Burkina Faso. No one asked if his people had rights. Now, years later, he was here, being asked if his words were too loud. "Do you think I speak for headlines?" he repeated silently in his mind. He glanced at Meghan. She didn't know. How could she? None of them knew that when he walks into meetings, he still hears the screams in his ears. He had come not for revenge, but for recognition of the forgotten, the voiceless, the unburied. And suddenly something shifted in the crowd. Meghan saw it too. People weren't just listening. They were leaning in, not just to hear his words, but to feel them. And he wasn't done speaking. Not even close. For a few seconds after Traoré's quiet, thunderous response, Meghan said nothing. She blinked twice. Then the stage lights hit her face just right, and something changed in her eyes. A flicker, maybe recognition, maybe something deeper. The room, once buzzing with global prestige, had become a graveyard of forgotten truths. Megan glanced down at her notes, then looked back up at him, slower this time. "I didn't mean to offend you," she said gently. But Traoré raised one hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to lift the moment. "You didn't offend me," he replied. "You reminded me why I'm here." His voice was calm, but the crowd sensed an emotional weight forming like a storm cloud above them. "My country has been called many things, poor, dangerous, insignificant, but never peaceful when it speaks." Someone in the crowd whispered, "Damn." He continued, "Yet peace is not silence, peace is not permission, and progress is not about who headlines applaud. It's about who the headlines ignore." A young black girl in the front row began to cry. Megan looked at her, then at him. The cameras kept rolling. And that's when a woman in the audience stood up, shaking, with a tremble in her voice. The woman who stood was in her late 60s, tall, wrapped in a deep blue head wrap and a scarf lined with tiny silver beads. "Excuse me," she said, voice wavering. "My name is Gloria Adebayo. I wasn't going to speak, but—" Her eyes welled up with tears. "I was born in Ghana, but raised in the UK. All my life, I was told to speak softly, be grateful, and don't be difficult." She turned toward Traoré. Today was the first time I felt seen in this place." The room froze again. Gloria clutched a photo in her hand. It was old, worn, folded from being opened too many times. She raised it. "This is my father. He died working for a British-owned gold mine in Kumasi. They never sent his body home. Just a check and silence." Tears streamed down her face now. "No one ever said his name on a stage this grand. Until now. Until you." She looked at Traoré. Her lips quivered. "Thank you for not speaking softly." Every journalist in the room had their cameras aimed, but none could capture the stillness of that moment. Even Megan looked shaken. But Traoré hadn't even told his truth yet. That was still coming. Later that evening, backstage, as the forum paused for a diplomatic coffee break, Traoré sat alone, holding a small red notebook. It had a leather strap wrapped around it, worn, tattered, no cameras, no aides, just him. Inside the notebook were handwritten names, nearly 300 of them, miners, farmers, schoolchildren, people who had died without headlines, without justice, victims of illegal land grabs, victims of multinational security responses. At the very back of the book was the name Awa Traoré, his mother. She'd died during a protest against foreign water control, shot by a bullet the investigation never traced. He never told the world, he never needed to. But now, something had changed. Megan entered quietly, alone. She looked different, not like a duchess, just a woman who had seen something break open. "You're carrying a lot," she said softly. Traoré looked at her, then down at the notebook. Not carrying, just remembering. Megan nodded slowly. "The world remembers headlines. You're asking it to remember names." He looked up. "That's all I've ever asked." Outside, the hashtag #DarkUnshakenTruth was climbing to 30 million mentions. But inside that notebook, there were no hashtags, just names, and one final message. When you speak for them, speak as if they're watching. Because maybe they were. The second day of the forum opened with tighter security, overflowing media vans, and whispers everywhere. Inside the hall, Traoré was set to speak solo. No panel, no moderation. The auditorium filled with ambassadors, journalists, students, and CEOs. Even those who had planned to skip day 2 came back. To witness a man who didn't flinch. A young French interpreter named Léon Marchand was assigned to translate Traoré's live speech. He had done hundreds before, but 5 minutes in, Léon stopped. Not because of a technical issue, because his throat locked up. Traoré was telling a story about a 9-year-old boy named Musa, shot in the back while fetching water during a border dispute. They said it was crossfire, Traoré said, but I buried him myself. There was only one bullet, and it came from the west. Leon dropped his headset and wept, right there on the translator's booth floor. The control room tried to cut the live feed, but the audience had already stood up in silence. No applause, just tears. Even Megan, now seated among journalists, had her hand over her mouth. This wasn't just a speech, it was a resurrection. That night, well past midnight, Megan sat alone in her suite overlooking the Thames. She'd turned her phone off hours ago, but something gnawed at her. The look in Traoré's eyes when he said, "Speak as if they're watching." She'd grown up in a world of press briefings, palace traditions, strategic silence. But this man didn't do strategy. He did truth, raw, dangerous, real. She logged into a private, unverified Instagram account. No press, no handlers. She typed slowly. President Traoré, I don't think I've ever felt smaller than I did today, but I also don't think I've ever respected someone more. I needed to hear that, thank you. She hovered over the send button, then hit it, and sat still. No reply came. Not that night. But across the world, her message wasn't the only one. Tens of thousands of people, Ghanaians, Haitians, Sudanese, Jamaicans, Kenyans, began writing in their truths, tagging Sao unshaken truth. Photos of unmarked graves, videos of dry wells, screenshots of land sold without consent. One girl in Sierra Leone simply wrote, "My uncle died building a bridge for a company that doesn't remember his name. But I will. Because Traoré reminded me to." On the third and final day of the forum, a segment titled Global Voices from the Grassroots was scheduled. Traoré requested one change: no politicians, just people. The organizers hesitated, but the public pressure was rising. They agreed. And so came Isaac Nwankwo, 87 years old, from Nigeria, a man with cloudy eyes and a cane carved from a tree he'd planted as a boy. He shuffled to the stage, stood next to Traoré, and said into the mic, "I watched my village disappear under foreign pipelines. They told us it was progress." His voice shook, but he continued. "Then one day, they buried my son. Not with ceremony, but with silence." He turned to Traoré and took his hand. "You speak loud, young man, but only because so many of us were forced to whisper. Don't you stop." The audience didn't clap. They stood, in total silence. And in that silence came tears, from journalists, from aides, from Megan, from grown men who'd sworn never to cry in public. Because the truth was no longer behind the microphone. It was walking, limping, rising, from every corner of that room. And Traoré? He just bowed his head. The red notebook was in his pocket, still waiting. Just hours before the final closing ceremony, Ibrahim Traoré received a private call. It was from his younger sister, Mariam, calling from Burkina Faso. She rarely reached out when he traveled, not out of fear, but protection. Media eyes were always watching. "I watched the forum," she said softly in Moore, their native tongue. "The woman, the one who stood and cried. Gloria, she reminded me of Mama." Silence. "Do you still carry the red notebook?" she asked. He touched his chest pocket. "Every day." Mariam's voice broke. "Then don't forget to say her name. The world is finally listening, Ibrahim." He didn't speak, just closed his eyes and remembered the last time he saw their mother, standing in a protest line, holding her water jar like a shield, refusing to move when the soldiers yelled. She had no microphone, only dignity. Back in London, Megan watched from her room as millions around the world tuned into the forum's live stream. Something historic was about to happen. But no one knew just how deep Traoré was about to take them, and what name he would finally say. When Traoré stepped onto the stage for the final keynote, the world was already watching. Over 120 million live views. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Before I begin, I want to say a name. Just one. Her name was Awa. She was my mother. A gasp swept through the room. She wasn't famous. She didn't have a degree. But she taught me about sovereignty long before I led a country. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the red notebook, slowly opened it. She died protesting water theft. Foreign companies had blocked our river and sent troops to silence the village. Mama stood in front of the gate. They shot her once and left her there. A woman in the front row collapsed into sobs. The world never said her name. No report, no headline, no justice, just silence. Traoré paused. But silence, he said, raising the notebook, can be broken. And today I break it for her, for all of them. He began reading names aloud, one by one. Children, teachers, fathers, mothers, each name like a bullet of memory piercing the silence. And one by one, the crowd started to repeat the names after him, until the entire room was echoing the voices of the dead. As the hall echoed with names, outside the London sky broke into heavy rain. Hundreds who couldn't get inside the venue stood in the downpour, huddled under umbrellas and plastic bags, watching on massive screens. A child from Somalia whispered the names along with the crowd. A grandmother from Uganda pressed her palm to the screen. The BBC tried to cut to commercial, but people wouldn't stop watching. Say their names, Traoré repeated. Not just here. Say them at your tables, in your classrooms, in your parliaments, on your phones. A lightning strike flashed. Because dignity is not a donation, it is a birthright. Inside, Megan cried openly now. Not from guilt, but from clarity. This man, she whispered, isn't trying to change politics. He's trying to resurrect memory. And outside in the soaking crowd, a man dropped to his knees, arms outstretched, whispering, Awa, I hear you now. Not even Buckingham Palace's Jubilee livestream could compete with the numbers anymore. By midnight, the speech was the most watched political event in internet history. But for Traoré, this wasn't history. It was healing, and he wasn't finished. Not yet. After the ceremony, when the crowd had thinned and the cameras stopped flashing, Megan sat alone in her car with a notepad across her lap. She hadn't said much since the names were spoken. Not during the final applause, not during the standing ovation, not even during the closing dinner. Something inside her had shifted, shattered in the most unexpected way. She began writing, not for the press, not for a statement, but a private letter. To President Traoré, I asked you a question that I now realize came from a place of pain I hadn't yet named. I was trying to challenge you, but instead, you challenged me. I've lived in palaces and tabloids. I know what headlines do. But your words, they didn't just echo. They opened old wounds in people I never thought I'd cry for. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it. She folded the letter, paused, then tucked it into her journal and stared out at the night. The world was buzzing with hashtags. But inside Megan, something quiet and sacred had begun. A reckoning. Back at his hotel, Ibrahim Traoré didn't sleep. He asked security to leave him alone. No guards, no aid. He sat on the floor of his room. No shoes, no robe. Just him, the red notebook, and silence. He placed the notebook beside him and opened a voice recording app. Then, with trembling breath, he began. Miriam, if I don't make it back, tell them I did what I could. Tell the people I didn't raise my voice for noise, but for memory. Tell them that I cried after saying Mama's name, not in public, but here, alone. He paused, wiped his face, continued. And if someday the world forgets again, then may this voice, may these names, may this notebook be a reminder. Africa is not broken. It has simply never been heard. His voice cracked. For the first time that week, he let his shoulders drop. And for 11 minutes, the president of Burkina Faso, soldier, leader, son, sat on the floor and wept like a boy. Outside, the city of London slept. But in 1,000 homes across the world, people were still watching the replay, whispering the names. The next morning, news anchors and journalists rushed to break down the moment. But they couldn't keep up, because what happened wasn't just viral, it was visceral. CNN called it the most human political speech ever recorded. Al Jazeera called it the African soul, unmuted. And over 190 million people had viewed the full broadcast within 36 hours. But one moment stood out. It wasn't a speech. It was just a name. Traoré had said it softly midway through his address, and paused as he did. And finally, to the one name I never wanted to say on a stage like this, he exhaled. Zyla. The crowd leaned in. She was 6, shot near a lithium mine. Her parents buried her with plastic bags because they had no cloth left. Her name was never reported, but I remember her. Zyla. And then, he did something no one expected. He placed a cloth doll on the podium, tattered, burnt, missing one eye. The room fell completely silent. Even the translators stopped speaking. That image, Traoré placing the doll down, became the icon of the movement. Not a logo, not a quote, just a name and a doll, a memory. The final event of the forum wasn't meant to be emotional. It was scheduled as a simple closing circle. World leaders were invited to say one sentence each. One sentence to summarize what they had learned. Traoré didn't even plan to speak. But then a little girl stood up in the far back row, maybe 9 years old. Skinny arms, nervous hands. The crowd turned. She didn't have a mic, but she cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "My name is Zyla too." Gasps rippled through the room. She held up a drawing of a girl holding a flag of Burkina Faso, crying but standing tall. I saw the doll. I heard the name. I thought, maybe I'm supposed to speak now. She stepped into the aisle. Everyone moved back for her. Diplomats, royalty, cameras. She walked down the center like history's daughter. Traoré stepped forward, eyes wide. She reached him, hugged him tightly without asking, and whispered, "Thank you for remembering us." He froze, then knelt down and whispered back, "Thank you for surviving." That image of Traoré kneeling and hugging the little girl went more viral than the doll. The whole world broke. In the days that followed, something strange and beautiful began to happen. Miners in South Africa held up signs that read, "Say my name." Children in Jamaica wrote poems titled Awa. Mothers in Palestine and Chicago uploaded videos whispering names of their lost ones into the camera. No music, no edits, just names. A UN official proposed an international memorial day called the Day of the Unheard. Burkina Faso's schools announced they'd start their school day by reading one forgotten name each morning. And Megan? She published the letter she never intended to. In it she wrote, "I thought my job was to ask questions, but the real power is in listening to those no one ever asks." Donations flooded grassroots causes across the global south, not through NGOs, but directly, quietly, intentionally. And Traoré? He returned home. No parade, no red carpet, just one speech from the steps of the presidential palace. Our pain is not entertainment, it's a testimony. And our truth is not just African, it's human. He held the red notebook in the air, and behind him, the crowd began to chant, Awa, Zyla, Musa, Gloria. For the first time in history, the dead were no longer forgotten. Late one evening, under a dim lamp, Traoré sat again, alone, with the red notebook. He turned to the last page, the only page he had never dared to touch. This time, he wrote, slowly, boldly, "To every soul whose name never reached a stage, you are not forgotten. You are the reason I speak. You are the fire beneath my silence. You are the drumbeat of a continent still rising." Then, for the first time since he was a child, he signed his name with tears in his eyes, not as president, but as Ibrahim. He closed the notebook, kissed it gently, and whispered, "You're heard now." And outside his window, the street children of Ouagadougou lit candles, one by one, singing no anthem, just humming, low, soft, real. In every country where the speech was watched, people left shoes outside their homes for one night, to honor the journeys that were never finished. And in London, a single doll, cloth, burnt, missing one eye, was placed on the steps of Parliament. Beside it, a note. Say their names, or lose your own soul. If this story moved you, if it made you cry, if you whispered even one name aloud, please don't scroll past. Like this video, not for views, but for the voices. Comment the name of someone you remember. Subscribe, not just for more stories, but because truth deserves a home. Together, let's flood this platform with dignity. Let's make sure the world never forgets again. Say their names. Traoré unshaken. We remember.